By 2005, the Australian Army was back in Afghanistan.
We think it's important that the progress made in Afghanistan is preserved and consolidated.
The Taliban had proved to be a ruthless and resilient opponent who still commanded authority and fear in many parts of the country. For the Australians, their mission had evolved.
In some ways it could be seen we're chasing a fight, but I think we're chasing the bad guys, which is where we had to be. Well, good work for a commander was going out and killing the enemy.
I'm doing right. Go.
Not sitting static and waiting for something to happen.
As well as counterinsurgency, they were also tasked with reconstruction, training and mentoring.
2005 marked a change in the way that Afghanistan was being progressed as a war. It really went from an attempt to remove the Taliban as an organisation and to target key leadership, back to trying to control the country or to rebuild it and to re-establish the Afghan government control over areas.
The battle was now for the hearts and minds of the Afghan people.
Australia's always been and always will be a junior partner in a much larger coalition. The Americans are very much in charge of this. You've got NATO much in charge of it, but you've also got what are the interests of the people of Afghanistan and their president, Karzai. So we do finish up in an area of our own at the operational level, which in this case was Oresgun province, and we probably got one of the harder provinces to deal with. It was a place as a bit of a rat run where the Taliban would sort of move through there, move into Pakistan, into Quetta and places like that. And it was also seen as a bit of a rest and recreation area for the Taliban. So we went into a pretty hot area.
They're almost living 2,000 years in the past. A bit of an exaggeration, but there's some villages you went to you couldn't drive a vehicle up the main roads because they're made for carts. And there's no electricity there, and they're cooking with open fires, and obviously the life expectancy is not that high, especially out in those outer-lying areas, and that's where we went to on the vehicle-mounted patrols.
The insurgents use the landscape and the terrain extraordinarily well. They are insurgents. They are from within the local people. They, whether through support or coercion, rely upon local resources, local people, for everything from where to sleep at night, to get something to eat, to look after their wounded and ill. So it's very, very difficult to definitively identify an insurgent.
The people there did not like foreigners, it's as simple as that. And they made that clear to us. And it wasn't a case of us now just rolling into a town and saying, here we are, we've liberated you from your previous hardship, don't you all love us? We actually had to win them on side.
Oh, that was a bit harsh.
And this was a group that didn't like us, they actively hated us. So you actually had to present a way forward to them that convinced them that, one, you were on their side, and two, that the future you were offering was better.
Operation Slipper continued as the first of 4 reconstruction task forces began arriving in September 2006.
My introduction to Afghanistan was the majestic beauty of the country, absolutely jaw-dropping with a biblical sense, with the huge mountains going into the sky, into the clouds, snow-capped peaks, rolling desert, and further in the lushly vegetated areas around the riverbed. I found that once you get closer in and you actually examine the country for what it is, it's not quite as serene.
It's basically like stepping back into, 400 AD, but with mobile phones and the occasional Toyota Hilux that was there. So it was a weird mix of certain technologies and things, and obviously enough technology to build bombs and that kind of stuff. but then so backwards in no electricity in half of these villages. They're using very old, irrigation techniques based on, piles of dirt and gravity.
The Australians were part of a Dutch-led team operating out of Tarin Kowt, based in Uruzgan province in central Afghanistan. The base would come to be known as Camp Holland.
Australia was still developing its relationships into NATO. The Dutch were looking for something to do. We were looking for something to do and a place to do it. And it just so happened that it was almost, and I'm going to say a happy marriage, because I think it was. There were real differences.
They come from a different approach to the Australians. They're certainly more focused on their community engagement, whereas the Australians took a more aggressive approach to the security situation within Uruzgan province. Many of the local community actually felt more comfortable with the Dutch because they tended to be more accommodating, they were more polite. Australians tended to be harder, so our guys tended to be firm but friendly. We're here to help, but don't mess with us. So you found that the two attitudes between soft and firm actually provided a good basis for us to work. So when we were working with the Dutch, it was quite convenient because in some cases they could play the good cop, we could play the bad cop, and that could also turn the other way.
Oh, no, thank you. We already have a lot of elements, so I'm really stuffed, actually.
The Dutch were operating on more restricted rules of engagement. This led to tensions. And then there was the food.
There was kippers and bread and cheese and things for breakfast. As Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd went over, and the first thing that happened was the diggers are straight into his face. We're not going to eat this Dutch shit. We want real Aussie food. And almost immediately send cooks. So we had to send army cooks over there.
And I can assure you that was as well received by the Dutch soldiers as it was by the Australian soldiers. The Afghan National Army were at a very early stage of their development. They largely subsisted by whatever they could buy from the local community. So for example, their meat ration walked in once a week on all four hooves, and then it was up to the soldiers to butcher and to prepare that animal for the next few days. And pretty tasty stuff it was too, some very fine curries. By sitting down and eating with someone, as we all appreciate, is another opportunity to get to know someone at another level. And for the mentors out on these patrol bases, that was just as important as talking to them in the normal course of their duties.
Once we got on the ground and all our forces got established, our first job was literally to drive around the AO to some of the key target areas that have been identified to us and get a feel of what the ground truth of the problem was. To go into Tarin Kowt to talk to the chief engineers, the governor and people like that to work out where the real problems lay within Uruzgan, the hospitals, the schools, things like that.
The memories that stick for me in Tarin Kowt was the fact that most of the streets were deserted, so there wasn't that human population that you expect to see in an urban centre. There were very few cars in town, which gets you thinking about how do they actually then get resources, food and fuel from Kandahar. And the checkpoints, the security checkpoints that were in town were deserted. Uruzgan province was in a drought in 2006. So the population was really starving and there was a whole heap of men occupying the hospital compound. And, you asked, because the question is if there's men here, where are the women? But that question was never actually directly answered for us. So you presumed that the worst had already happened to the women and their families and the men were what was left. And then you met children inside the hospital who were just stoically cracking on with life, so to speak, despite missing a limb from having lost that in the IED attack that had happened the week before. Through the interpreters, a lot of the locals would say to us, "Don't come near me, I don't want to talk to you because otherwise the Taliban will kill me," or words to that effect. So I remember that kind of feeling of nervousness about Tarin Kowt and the
feeling that nothing was moving forward, and this feeling that, you know, why move forward if you don't know what your future holds?
The Afghan people tended to be very emotionally adept. They could read body language. There were a number of occasions where I felt I was in meetings with the Afghan local leadership and they weren't listening to what I was saying. The translator would be translating and I wasn't sure whether they were translating what I said. But it appeared that the local leaders were actually watching my body language and watching those around me to see what was going on. And they were taking their cues from the body language, not from the words. And that tended to stretch, I felt, across the entire community.
But we need you to help us to help you.
When you are trying to talk to the local people, obviously it helps if you can speak their language. So we needed the interpreters. From their perspective, it was very dangerous. I mean, these guys were siding obviously with us. They would wear camouflage equipment like us. They would be identified as us. When the locals were speaking to them, they knew that they were part of our team. So from their perspective, they were putting themselves, you know, in a position of real vulnerability. Without them, we simply could not function.
The Australian Army worked closely with other coalition forces. Australian Chinook helicopters provided vital support, dropping supplies across the vast province.
So the Chinooks were the workhorse of the conflict as far as moving personnel equipment around because they were perfectly suited to it. Every time that a Chinook or a pair of Chinooks conducted a mission, there would be a lot of vehicles that didn't have to drive over potentially very dangerous ground in order to move it across a battle space. Chinook is a very big target, especially if the landing zone's big enough for multiple Chinooks. And in that case, if we're going to be on the ground for an extended period of time, we would be definitely looking to get some form of overhead protection in the form of American Apache or Kiowa helicopters. It's hard to tell if we're ever shot at by day, especially. However, at night time, you definitely would see the traces. So you knew if you were being engaged, and you'd see the quite often termed orange tennis balls or golf balls whizzing past the aircraft.
Unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, were used for reconnaissance and to track targets.
Our main role was recon. So we did a lot of reconnaissance, route reconnaissance. We also did a lot of direct support of convoy overwatches and foot patrols as well. You can never make a exact judgment on what you're seeing. A lot of the time it's possibly something or probably something. The Taliban got very good at actually using the foliage and the aqueducts to cover their movement, and it was very hard for us sometimes.
Medical teams provided health care for both international forces and the Afghan people.
Our average day, our main role as the Australian force was to provide primary health care, being cough, colds and sore holes, for lack of a better term. And then 2 times a week we were the on-call team for traumas in the emergency bay. So the Americans would do the other 5 days, we'd be on call. However, if it was an Australian soldier who came in, they'd call us and we would take the lead.
The majority of the civilian casualties we saw were basically humanitarian aid and numerous, particularly 12 to 15-year-old kids who'd been just caught in the battle. Not the direct battle involving the ISAF forces and Taliban, but mine injuries, disputes, which ultimately, quite often in Afghanistan, end in the use of firearms.
We've been set a task, go there, but then you look around and say, what can I do? How can I help? And it's about not just the military, but it's also about the aid support that they need. It's also about the political support. It's also about the diplomatic support. It's about building schools, about building water reticulation systems, building sewage systems. That this is a bigger problem than just the military.